So it's more of a mindset rather than like, particular processes, methods, and these kinds of things. Because, I mean, let's be honest, the methods we can learn, we can read a book. We don't need to do a master's yet, right? There's so many like toolkits online and like method libraries and these kinds of things. But I think the challenge comes in actually knowing how to apply them, and apply them not only in the context where you have like-minded people, but actually apply them in the context of client-facing situation where you often have people that aren't familiar with that mindset, and you need to communicate the value, you need to bring them along, you need to draw them into the process as well, so that there's buy-in as well.
Designing the future is essential for shaping the world we want to live in. That's why it's more crucial than ever to be strategic about it, think long-term, and embrace complexity rather than avoid it. The field of strategic design is growing, and as two strategic designers, we want to explore how it's changing the way we design products, buildings, organizations, and landscapes. In this podcast, we'll interview strategic designers and professionals in the field, hoping to enlighten both ourselves and others about the future of designing with a strategic mindset and skill set. We are Emily and Isaac, both strategic designers with different backgrounds. Isaac is an industrial designer from Finland, and Emily has a business background in design culture and economics from Denmark. Join us for today's conversation with our guest, where we'll be unfolding strategic design. Welcome on today's episode that we're recording at the design agency Designit in their offices in Copenhagen. Today we're meeting Jonas Schmidt, who works at Designit as a senior business designer. Before joining Designit, he unfolded his career as a strategic design lead at Contrapunkt, which started as an internship during his graduate study in strategic design and entrepreneurship at CBS. Jonas furthermore has a bachelor in strategic management from the University of Innsbruck. So welcome, Jonas, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
For all the listeners who don't know you, can you tell them about who you are and what you do for a living?
Sure, yeah. Ooh, what I do for a living? That's a big question already. Well, my name's Jonas. I'm German born. I've been, studying management and economics in Innsbruck, Austria. Probably also because I really liked skiing. Then I was quite curious and I think culturally drawn to the Nordics, where I then explored a little time abroad in Helsinki. And I just got closer and closer, I think, to realizing that really, the traditional business studies and these kinds of things is a little bit too focused on optimizing the status quo and, analytical thinking. So I got more drawn into the world of design, you could say, and fascinated by it. And so, when I came to Copenhagen, I think 6 years ago, I came for work and I was considering whether I should do a bachelor's in design in some sort of capacity. Then I found the master's degree, as you were saying, strategic design and entrepreneurship. And I think that for me really opened up a whole new way of relating to things, and it kind of changed my perspective on things, my way of thinking. I think it encourages, what I would say whole brain thinking. So, it's both still analytical, it's both still creative. And I really found, I think, myself in there. And so, I since then have been working within that field in various capacities across architecture, for a short amount of time, then within branding, particularly at Contrapunkt, UX as well, service design, then more and more into strategic design, also worked mainly as a strategist, I should add. And now at Designit as a business designer, which I think that could span the length of this podcast, what that really means. And I don't know if I know, but you could say it's essentially, applying strategic design methods and mindset to really any sort of challenge. So I think we work across a spectrum, I like to say, across kind of from heavy communications projects like branding, campaign, these kinds of things, to on the other side, very innovation driven projects. We do a lot of foresight as well and these kinds of things. And so us being an end-to-end provider, we get to put on these different hats, I think, and kind of just apply the same kind of thinking and structured problem solving, you could say, to a very wide array of problems, which is quite exciting, which is, I think, also why I like it so much. I do a lot of research in my day-to-day. I formulate a lot of insights. We do a lot of visioning as well, like coming up with strategic scenarios. But it also includes a lot of things transformation at large. So whenever I think there is a moment in time where, the old thing doesn't work anymore, and what do you have to do? You need creativity. And I think that's where, us as business designers, strategic designers come in. So we also work with, value proposition design, venture design, business model design, these kinds of things, which I really enjoy. So yeah,
wow.
It's a lot.
What can't you do? What don't you do?
Well, and that's also the pitfall of it, really, right? Yeah, it's hard to delineate. It's hard to really define. But yeah, it's quite broad.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Interesting. We're going to dive into your position here at Designit and really dive into what you do. But if you go back to when you started studying strategic design, why did you choose the specific program here in Denmark?
I think, it's very unique, right? In that it combines students with a background in business and entrepreneurship with students in a background from design and architecture. And I really think it's at that kind of, it's this thing of whole brains thinking where you both need creativity and you both still need the analytical side as well and the business vocabulary to actually, I think, also engage with stakeholders in a meaningful way. Where I think that's just so unique that there's a program where these two profiles come together and are almost kind of like thrown into one room to kind of like and close the door and see what happens, to figure it out, how to work with both sides of the equation, both kind of sides of the brain. So that really drew me to it. And I think, as I said, I was kind of seeking ways of how I could upskill, you could say, and find ways to leverage design thinking, design ways of working in my kind of capacity as a strategist. And that fitted in quite nicely. And then it's also just minded people, which never hurts.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Were there any resources along the way that helped you when you studied the strategic design and made you also develop your competencies in a certain way?
Yeah, I really... And maybe I should say this up front. I'm actually not a podcast guy. I don't know what it is. I can't learn when I listen to things. So for me, it's reading. And one thing that I really like, that I think I really kind of dove into was Medium. I don't know if you're familiar with that platform. So I love that. And I think there I got a lot of kind of like one thing leads to the other and you just investigate further. So I think a lot of things that were guiding me and resources that were guiding me were curiosity led and then kind of led into other things. And again, I think that's also like, as you were saying, what isn't strategic design? What is it? It's the nice thing, but also the downside of it. I think it really depends on you, what you do with it and where your curiosity lies. Because you can apply it in such a wide array of situation contexts. But I think, like reading a lot, Medium, but books, of course, in general. And then just the network of people there as a resource, really, right? Bouncing off ideas with people that share similar interests and these kinds of things.
Was there already during your studies something that you could already pinpoint to something that you were interested in more than the other stuff?
Yes, definitely. I think what I'm drawn to is complexity and complex challenges. And I have a long-lasting passion for sustainability at large. And for me, systems thinking and in particular applied to urban planning was always something that I was quite passionate about. So it was super nice to also have architects, to spar and really dive into that and also have the possibility to engage in student projects through the program to get that side. So that was something that I was quite naturally drawn to. And in general, I think, again, like the more wicked the problem, the nicer. And I think also through that program, it gave me access to consultancy and agency models, or kind of it opened the door to, these kinds of places, which I was curious about for a long time as well. Because one thing is, I think, complexity, but I'm also someone who gets tired of things quite quickly, which can be a big downside as well. But, within the agency context or consultancy context, you do more work. You have different challenges every so many months, which is quite nice. So there's, this kind of recurring thing in there as well. So I think that's what I also figured out through the program, that I was drawn to, that, it probably isn't in-house for me, at least straight away. And I probably don't want to apply to things that are, to more, you could say, fixed positions in-house somewhere. But really, now that I have that opportunity, why not see what that consultancy experience would look like. And I was drawn to that through my business studies still, but that was from a more traditional management consultancy perspective, which I realized through having experience on the surface of it that just doesn't fit my personality. So now having access to consultancy work within strategy still, but through a creative lens with like-minded people and a culture that I identify with, was just nice. Yeah, and I think I saw that way forward through the study program.
Did you then end up here, or how did your route look like after you graduated?
So I ended up at Kontrapunkt first, where I started as an intern within strategy. And that kind of got extended to then, to student position, then as a strategist, and, as I said, also, endeavor in UX design, UX strategy, and actually starting up these capabilities within Kontrapunkt as well, and establishing a little team. Eventually trying to establish, a strategic design capability within Kontrapunkt as well. And then I think at some point the time was there for me to say, I want to explore place that has a strong heritage beyond branding, which for me, that was Designit, which is very rooted in, the typical design thinking process of you can apply this to many types of problems and being okay with ambiguity and being confident and trusting the process very much, as cliche as it sounds. And I think that drew me to the place. I'm here now since a year. And yeah, I enjoy quite a lot. Very different projects.
Yeah, I could also imagine that the academic world, in contrast to where you are now, is quite different. Was it a shock to first spend 2 years studying strategic design and then actually trying to use it for something? How was that transition?
That's a good question. I think actually not. I think actually, weirdly enough, yes, academia, it's a different way of working and a different way of thinking. And I also struggled with that, I think, in the beginning in academia. I came to love it. It was like, looking back, really kind of like a luxury to be able to dive into topics that are of interest to you. But then actually, I think funnily, when I started applying it, I could really draw on a lot of the things that I have taken with me from the strategic design program. Which, looking back, actually, I haven't reflected on this before, but I think that's actually quite astonishing that, an academic program, which is a master's program, is so applicable in my everyday. And we spoke about this before, right? But I think the key takeaways from this program for me is really a structured way of approaching challenges of any kind of sort. So it's more of a mindset rather than particular processes, methods, and these kinds of things. Because, let's be honest, the methods we can learn, we can read a book. We don't need to do a master's yet, right? There's so many toolkits online and method libraries and these kinds of things. But I think the challenge comes in actually knowing how to apply them, and apply them not only in the context where you have like-minded people, but actually apply them in the context of client-facing situation where you often have people that aren't familiar with that mindset, and you need to communicate the value, you need to bring them along, you need to draw them into the process as well, so that there's buy-in as well. So I think, that the program gave me that mindset to do that as well. And I think through, some of the experiences that we could gain through the program, it really has helped me quite a lot in the everyday. Yeah, I think that was actually quite a nice transition. I never thought about that. Yeah.
We also have had these discussions that sometimes you can't maybe see it, or it also depends on your experience throughout school, right? But how do you actually apply it? But also, how do you maybe convince is not the right word, but how do you also translate and sell it to a potential client that this will actually give value, and not maybe by just buy this and apply it now and get the value tomorrow, but also in the far future, right?
That's a big question. And I think it's a great question, because that's something that just yesterday we had an event on, using, again, the role of design within, you could say, transitions, like systems transitions, which in a commercial context, that's hard to sell. Or at Kontrapunkt, we did a lot of futures design kind of work, or at least kind of like thought leadership in that. And the question is always, how do you frame the value? How do you sell the value of that? And I think design still has, even after the craze of design thinking and, all these kinds of influential things like McKinsey talking about the value of design and these kinds of things, I think, again, probably maybe even more so than a couple of years ago, there is this advocacy that needs to happen for the value of design. And that can be hard because I think then you also speak about measurability, right? And a lot of things in design, I think design is, the unique thing is that it's, unlike a lot of other practices, there is no right or wrong. There is just a better or worse. And that probably also depends on your perspective, who's to say that one design approach to, especially branding, for instance, is definitively better than the other. There's taste in that, there's cultural preferences in that, there's all these kinds of things in that. There is no right or wrong. Also means that it's sometimes hard to measure, right? Certain things like revenue growth and these kinds of things, you can measure them quite quickly, and maybe you can find a causation in that correlation. But other things like, I think that design, or at least we apply design in, which is in the transformational context, then you talk about cultural transformation. How do you measure how a culture is evolving and these kinds of things? They become more intangible and therefore also often harder to prove the value of, rather. It's then, I think, more a case of doing these things and then having success cases that prove that value rather than only through a metric, and having kind of voices that you can use as references where it has created impact rather than necessarily a measurable change. So I think that's a great question. Like, how do you communicate the value of design, really, right? And it is an uphill battle.
Yeah. And in that sense, revenue, as you said, also that's the easiest way to also measure it. And often it also makes sense. If you are trying to prove that you are doing something right, just look at the numbers. But I also know that you have been talking about different versions of growth. Could you maybe speak a little bit about that? Because that feels very relevant then for design to come in that context.
Yes. Yeah, sure. So I think maybe just to cover the grounds, I think the idea is that as we kind of, realize that things need to change, we're living, especially in the global north, we're living beyond our means, like big time. And we are so far off on all the things that we should do. I think one realization that is creeping in there more and more is to actually question, the underlying logic of our economic system, which is growth centric. A lot of these things, they focus on growth, right? The growth is kind of seen as the goal, where you could then really argue, why is that? Really, why is that? Because growth doesn't really measure whether it's good growth or bad growth. Especially GDP is just one number. It doesn't measure if you grow tobacco industry or if you grow the renewable energy industry. It doesn't measure anything really, right? But what should be the goal is actually social and environmental well-being. And there is a lot of evidence that points to the fact that that's actually not necessarily correlated to economic growth after a certain point. When you come to the overshoot thing, there's like the donut economics kind of Kate Raworth example, right? Of, we do need to cover our basic needs, but then there's overshoot as well. And so there's these new kind of ideas like of well-being economy and these kinds of things that really question the supremacy of growth and growth as the ultimate goal, and really say, hey, if anything, it should be a means to an end. And I think in the context of sustainability, that means like growth has a big role to play, because we have so many pledges, ambitious pledges for net zero, for instance, right? But the difficult thing is that not only do you need to become more efficient with how you produce things and, drive energy efficiency and these kinds of things, but you also need to do that while you grow. So you produce more and more and more and have to drive absolute reductions. So there's kind of like this, this discrepancy of two curves going the other way around. And that kind of gap between how much you produce versus how much you emit, for instance, if you're only talking CO2, is like growing to an infinite amount. even like 3% growth rate, that would mean that by 2050, that would mean double the amount of things that you produce now. So, when there's all these 2050 pledges, for instance, growth just makes that a lot harder to achieve. So, within that context, again, I think sustainability then often, is through like CSRD and these kinds of directives is seen as an accounting challenge where it's like, okay, let's report on it. Let's measure where the emissions come from and see what you can do. When really it's a creativity challenge, right? And it's calling for imagination of what would it mean if we became growth independent? What would it mean to actually, what would, even just in the current context, what could be alternative business models rather than, just tweaking things within the existing system? You need creativity for that. And I think that's where designers can play a huge role. And that's where I think us as a design agency can play a huge role as well. One thing is, for instance, how do you move business models away from relying on selling things, right? Like if you're a clothing company, for instance, the only point in time where you capture value is when you sell an item. So that means that even for you to only stay at a certain level of revenue, you need to sell items the whole time, right? All and all and all again. But if you say, okay, there's so much lifetime happening after the point of sale, could you extract value through that? Could you have like, instead of like a take, make, expose kind of business model, approach more circular business models that don't depend so much on growth, but where you can actually capture value during the use period. So there's examples like, Philips, they have light as a service. So you don't have to sell light bulbs. You actually, people subscribe to light. So there's a recurring revenue and you capture value ongoingly. And there's an incentive for you to save energy because you as Philips now have to pay the bills. They're only paying for light. Or like, again, in the clothing context, is it about resell, repair, these kinds of things? Like how can you extract value and create incentives for you not having to sell more, essentially? That's one instance, right? But I think in essence, the question really is, you see more and more the dilemma where there's big pledges that have been made years ago, like 2016, 2017 towards 2030, which back then felt very far away. All of a sudden, it's very close and we are so off. I mean, I don't want to name examples here, but there's very big brands. One in particular, a shoe brand, that have committed to 30% reductions by 2030. And they're at 1.6%. So, and it's like, you can say the same about, for instance, Google, right? Like now with AI, all of a sudden they have to license nuclear power plants to satisfy the demand for electricity to power their new services, which is another example of like, growth being totally counterproductive to the pledges. And I think also a big reason why these pledges are so off. And I think it needs creativity to get out of that that kind of gridlock. And then I think also, when you talk about these kind of systems change is always, who should start? Like, there's politicians, there's industry, there's consumers, and there's so many parts that have to play together. And then I think us designers can play the role as facilitators, process facilitators quite well, who actually, gather people and facilitate a dialogue and make it productive and make things tangible, provoke the right conversations and these kinds of things. So there's a huge role to play, I think, in that.
Rather than being the one who's actually pointing fingers and saying you should do like this and this and this.
Exactly. The frustrating thing here, I think, often is like, and I think that's also why a lot of people have kind of stopped speaking about it. There is this risk of, a lot of the things, pretty much everything that we do is not enough, but it's an important thing to do nevertheless. But I think, a lot of people are afraid to share some of their progress and even maybe experiment with it because they know it in itself won't solve things. And even within, the sustainability community, there's a lot of, pointing fingers on initiatives that, yes, they're not enough in themselves, but they maybe steer the system into the right direction. So I think that becomes unproductive, right? To think like in the maybe even the traditional design thinking way of like, there's a problem and there's a solution. There is not one problem and there is not one solution. It's a set of problems, right?
And as a business designer here at Designit, do you work with these alternative models and business models, economies in practice?
Partly, I think majority-wise not. I think it really just depends on the project. But every now and then there is an opportunity to bring conversations like this up. And again, then I think it comes down to being able to prove the value of that. Hey, there is an opportunity. You have a problem. We can fix it through looking at things like alternative business models. And I don't think I can share which client it was, but there is a very big Danish client where we had the challenge of saying, okay, how could we create business models, value capture models that kind of shift the focus away from the point of sale to the use period? How can we circulate the products that we already have out there, because there is a lot, and kind of create value through that again? Because at the end of the day, if you don't prove the value, it's really hard to argue for. So that was a really cool project where I think we came up with like 3 scenarios for how that could look like, and parts of that were implemented. So parts of that, not the whole thing. But I think again, it's also about giving, provoking conversations internally within an organization that hopefully can travel. I mean, these organizations, especially larger corporations, there's really like lock-in effects, right? I mean, they're planning ahead, and change happens quite slowly there. But it's through these kinds of projects where I think you can almost sometimes use it a little bit as like as a Trojan horse, where there is an opportunity to come in and you find a sponsor within an organization, and then you can do it on a project basis. But maybe that one project can create actually conversations within that organization that are bigger than that.
How does your conversation with them usually look like? And is this something that, I mean, they obviously have to approach you first, maybe not always, but sometimes. And is it because they kind of are forced to do it and they have to look at different alternatives? Or is it actually that someone in this organization would like to change?
Good question. I think often it's a reactive thing, in that something seems off for someone in that organization. And it's probably a risk mitigation thing when, the environment is changing, and the environment is changing. I mean, especially in the European Union with all the regulations, that's a big part. I think, like, again, CSRD, for instance, I think has huge implications actually for businesses, which is great. So I think oftentimes it's, the case where, an organization can tell that they will need to evolve, otherwise they won't be future fit. So it's a risk mitigation thing of, staying relevant going forward, whether that's from a brand perspective, which is also very often the case. I mean, have you seen the latest like Jaguar rebrand, for instance?
Yes.
I think that's like an example of like, oh shit, it's really changing. It's really changing. How do we stay relevant and what do we do? And then I think that's often the way in for a conversation. And then often, an organization, people within that organization would have a preconceived notion of what potential solutions might be. And then I think, again, designers, we're kind of taught to, challenge the brief, which is something that is definitely being done. Also, done in a way where it's productive, of course. But you can come in, and I think, and that's why I think actually that early phase where you actually scope projects and these kinds of things, that's almost, it can seem a little bit boring maybe, because it's a lot about like numbers, project plans, and these kinds of things. But it's really where you set the direction for what to deliver and what to look at, where to put the focus on, priorities, and these kinds of things. So if you scope it wrong, doesn't matter how well you deliver. If you deliver the wrong thing, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. So it's these early conversations that I'm quite fascinated about. But I think it's mainly a reactive thing. And then it's much harder to kind of, try to proactively convince people that, hey, there's an opportunity. Because, I mean, it's not, let's be honest, it's also not really the time where there's a lot of budget for experimentation and this. I mean, it's a little bit tight, right? The market at the minute. And I think people are more on the risk mitigation side. So you maybe see things like Jaguar and
yeah. What do you think is the tactic behind that? Let's get into that.
I mean, I have no idea. This is all speculation, right? But we've also talked about it a lot. And there is very varying opinions on that. Actually, before I answer that, what's your opinion on it?
I actually haven't seen it.
Okay. It's super interesting. I think that I get the almost the anger from the consumers, but it's also from consumers who doesn't even own the product. So it's a global brand, and for some it might even, they're from the UK, right? Yeah, it's a UK brand. So for some people from the UK might almost associate with the brand in that sense. But I think it's interesting that people are working so much against it, even though they don't even own the product. And the same thing happened with Ital as well.
I was just gonna.
They did like similar, not similar, but like not as
similar,
not maybe as extreme. But yeah. But it was very different.
It was, and it spurred very similar reactions by consumers, right?
And I also wonder if that could have been like a tactic in a sense to just evoke these feelings in order to get more eyes on the brand. Could be one. I think like the numbers have spiked for Jaguar lately as well. I don't know, but big risk.
So it's I had I drew the same parallel with Italy when I saw that. Actually, it was funny that you brought it up. I mean, wow, it generated reactions. People are talking about it. I think where they're probably coming from is, I mean, the mobility sector is changing so much, and competition within that is changing so much, right? So I think, again, for them, it was a question of, we're a heritage brand that's known for combustion engines and have been doing that really well, excitement and all these, like, competing on all these parameters that maybe going forward are becoming, for a mass market, less relevant, because EV vehicles just compete on other things like reach, and they have all quite a lot of, they're all quite fast and all these kinds of things. So I think it's like, I would probably assume that they've realized that they might need to evolve as the market needs to evolve, and they were looking for their new role within that market and what that might look like. So I see the need to reconsider and do something new. The execution, that's I think more like there you can have strong opinions. I mean my personal opinion is I too find it very odd. I think it's very risky to take so much brand equity that was in that Jaguar brand and essentially kind of discard that, like the entire legacy. But then you brought that up as well a little bit, right? Am I the one to judge? Am I the intended audience? I don't own a car. I probably won't own a car in the next couple years, if ever. I don't believe in personal car ownership, so I'm probably definitely not the target audience. So it's also not really for me to judge. I would trust that they have done their research, and I would trust that there is a rationale behind it. If not, that would really surprise me, because again, someone needed to have been convinced for that to have happened. But yeah, from a craft perspective, I also find it, I find it hard to understand.
Yeah.
And it was the same with Italy. And I think an interesting thing there is both cases drew heavily from the lifestyle segment and detached themselves more and more from the product, right? Because I think traditionally it was always lifestyle more and more, but often it was, how does the product enable that lifestyle for you? So like, for instance, the Nike better shoe, better you, you becoming an athlete through the shoe. There's a link to the product. But in both Jaguar case and Italy case, which is so fashion driven, I think the link becomes weaker, and it's so much about lifestyle and so little about the product itself, which is, it's maybe signaling a bigger shift that's happening at large, where it's just really purely becoming lifestyle that you're selling rather than a product, and the product just kind of subtly enables that, fits into that. But I don't know, like, I just love well-crafted products, and generally, I think that's part of why we consume so fast, because preferences for lifestyles and desirability change so much, where culturally you could ask, is that a good thing?
It will also be interesting to see if other brands as well will kind of jump on this train and do these more extreme rebranding tactics. I don't know, like maybe this is also a way for them to find different solutions to only then selling the product. And maybe they are then looking into other options to then get some sort of growth.
Yeah, and then if you take the Jaguar case again, they're probably in a position where they're like, well, traditionally, we have been, and people love us for this like UK mysterious kind of, excitement for driving, petrol head type thing. How do you play these brand parameters in an EV future if it's not only for a niche market that loves driving on the weekend with their old petrol cars, right? And that's not a sustainable market to go for. So I get why they had to look at this. But again, execution is another question.
Could you sense that strategic design is easily connected with branding? And do you think that's a fair categorization, or do you think that there's more or less to it?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, I must say yes, because that was kind of my path. I did brand strategy a lot and I'm still doing it on certain projects. And I have never been trained in communications or as a brand strategist. So hopefully, yes. Otherwise, where's my legitimacy?
But it also makes sense because branding is sort of a holistic perspective and strategic design is the same, right?
Yeah. I was going to say exactly. So I think, branding, you can, again, view this from different kind of perspectives. Branding can be about selling things and, creating a desirable position. But more and more, especially on a corporate level, branding is actually, it's the thing that enables companies to pause, look up, and actually ask the big questions. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What are we actually pursuing here? And, that's the biggest question you could ask, really. And I think if you think about branding through that, then business strategy, and I'm probably going to offend some people here, but that then actually becomes a little bit more tactical, right? Because once you have a winning aspiration and a reason for doing things, then is looking at, okay, how do you actually achieve that? Where then, ironically, strategy becomes a tactical thing. So I think branding in that sense is beautiful. And also, if you have the right access to the right people, that's when you can, again, trigger transformations, right? Where you can really set the course for an organization. I mean, look at Jaguar, right? For that brand to actually come alive successfully, let's assume they're sticking with that, everything will have to change culturally as well. You can't have petrol heads run that company. Do you know what I mean? Like it just wouldn't work. So, I mean, everything would then, the brand becomes the North Star for all other decisions, really, like a compass internally and externally for decision making. And that's very powerful. And then, with branding is also the question of brands, one thing is creating a brand identity and a brand platform, these kinds of things, but brands don't exist until they exist in your head and in your head, right? And you could also say, like, again, with the Jaguar brand, if 100,000 people will see it, there's 100,000 brands almost existing, right? And you can just guide that. So it's by nature a long-term process. And also, like, just if you keep on changing your brand, you won't have a brand. So there's also, this element of foresight to branding, which I think lends quite well to designers and their kind of disposition to not be obsessed and held down from like status quo bias too much and actually looking ahead and using, foresight capabilities to do that. And again, also, it's an opportunity seeking thing as well, right? Where you say, okay, what could be our role? Like, what role would we like to play? And that's a holistic thing where you have to think systems, right? You have to also think like what would make sense. And it's more and more, I think, within branding, it's also about, it's less competition and more cooperation where you just fit into, you play one part of that puzzle. Let's say, again, like green transition is a huge thing for that, right? Obviously. And no brand can save the planet. Like no brand can create the change needed alone. It's all about collaboration and kind of fitting into a bigger narrative and playing their part. So it's, also, again, facilitating a process of like, what discourse do you want to tap in? And yeah, it's very holistically. And then I think the last thing also why I think brand strategy is quite suited for designerly ways of working, or designers even, is one thing is having conversations about it. I mean, one thing is talking about Jaguar and saying, hey guys, wouldn't it be cool if we did XYZ? Another thing is showing it, right? Another thing is making it tangible and putting it in front of people and having a conversation on that, because all of a sudden everyone can see it and they can comment on it and they can imagine what that would look like. And that's for branding, but that's, I mean, also at large, even if you talk, systems, transition design, these kinds of things. See the vision and then you can plan towards it. So yeah, it's very suited for, I think, through that. But then there's also like, also I think where I'm probably not the greatest is like when that work is done and it becomes about, the more detailed work of like, okay, what's the messaging? Like, where do you activate these kinds of things? That's also when I'm, I think definitely exiting the process. like bit by bit and handing over to people who just know that better. And I think there's a reason to be trained in communications. So yeah, yes, within limits.
Yeah, but that's also essentially what the strategic design and entrepreneurship program teaches you, is sort of to acknowledge your own expertise area, actually what you're capable of doing and what you're not capable of doing. So some are good within communications, as you say, and some are actually much better in facilitating. So there you really get to recognize your own limits, but also your strengths.
Yeah, definitely. That's true. And again, I think that's also like an embodiment of the program, right? It's this idea of being okay with not putting a label on your discipline and actually working cross-disciplinary. And as hard as that sometimes is to then also describe what it is that you're doing, it just makes sense. And I think you need that more and more in a world that realizes that we're living in an entangled system of smaller systems that all need to speak to each other, and we can't drive change here without affecting change there, and vice versa. So hopefully, there will be more interdisciplinary collaboration, to use curriculum word.
Do you think we'll see more strategic designers in the future facilitating these interdisciplinary processes?
I think so, yes or no. I must actually say, I think, and that's painful to say, but I think there's a recline in at least explicitly labeled opportunities within strategic design. I think it fell into a buzzword trap to a degree, which I agree with. And that's also why I'm saying, what the hell is strategic design? I don't know. It's many things, and it's probably you ask 3 people, you get 3 questions. And yes, there is definitions. And I agree with them, but then there's also other definitions I also agree with them, I think that's a huge problem. And I think that's why, like design thinking, that was really picked up by the industry. Strategic design was really picked up by the industry as well. And there were strategic designers. And now you have management consultancies like Bain, advertising strategic designer positions as well. That took a while to get there. But I think that also shows a maturity within the market. And sadly, somehow, from my viewpoint at least, and I don't have any evidence to back that up, but it seems like, again, like the explicit opportunities within strategic design are becoming less. But that doesn't mean that, again, the mindset that strategic design represents is becoming less applicable, even in from a job market perspective. But I think it's then more embedded within roles of business development, for instance, and innovation and these kinds of things, innovation facilitation as well. Mm-hmm. So they exist, but again, you have to find them. So if you come in with this mindset of I'm a strategic designer, I need to be a strategic designer by title as well, I think that will become increasingly hard. And part of that, again, is you could say, does inflation and geopolitical instability, does that play into, the market prioritizing surviving the status quo over seeking new opportunities and investing in R&D? Maybe. Could be a reason why there's, in the agency industry or consultancy industry as well, there's increased competition over recent years, I would say. And that's probably also why, there's maybe less roles that focus, I think, very much on opportunity seeking, which I think strategic design is, rather than optimizing status quo again.
Do you think that there should be one definition of what strategic design that everybody could kind of agree on? Or do you think also that's kind of the beauty of it, that we don't have it? It's kind of like the same where industrial design sometimes was also called product design, but today it's something completely different and doesn't represent it at all.
Because of digital product design.
Exactly. And there has definitely been some confusement around that. I get excited every time I see a job posting about product design, because I'm an industrial designer. So I got so confused by that. And there's way more opportunities when it comes to digital product design.
But the question of should there be a definition is a good one. I don't know. I mean, I think of it. I also think for instance, say sustainability. Is there a definition? I mean, there's the what is that, UN Brundtland report kind of definition. But I think even within the ESG industry, people understand sustainability very differently. And again, from the post-growth perspective, we spoke about that earlier, right? That's another definition entirely, and that's evidence-backed, science-backed as well. I mean, there's people who really believe in energy efficiency will, be the way forward, and resource efficiency and these kinds of things. And that is sustainable, or at least it's more sustainable than not doing it. But is it sustainable? You know what I mean? Like, is it just doing less damage? So yeah, I think in sustainability, that's hard. And I think that's maybe almost beneficial because it's context dependent. And then that's the same thing with design, right? Design is like, if you ask a designer anything, the question will always be, well, it depends. And that's annoying, but that's also good because it is context dependent. So I don't know. I mean, it would be nice to have one definition that everyone understands, but that would probably also limit the opportunities in which strategic design can be applied for, right? So, and like if you compare it to industrial design, there's a very defined application field within that, right? I would argue a little bit more than as within strategic design, where you really can, you can have people within politics and policy advisory.
But isn't it also so that strategic design is a systemic perspective? So when you look at the scope of it, it's actually the only thing that reaches out to include all of the different levels of thinkings and doings in how we design. So that's also maybe why I should say that it encompasses so many different fields and it's very complex and difficult to define.
That's true. I do think, though, if I think about it, like, again, I just think about the analogy of sustainability because I think it has the same issues like strategic design in that it means a lot of things. I think whenever you have a term that is ill-defined, you somehow also risk that terms after kind of a high period starts losing relevance. Yeah. I don't know. Like, I think when people can't grasp something entirely, at some point they will give up. You know what I mean? Like, leave me alone. That's strategic design. Like, what is it? Just say you're a strategist or whatever. Like, Jesus.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, I think it's problematic, to be honest. I think it's too wide. Yeah, because like you can almost say like, oh, there's probably strategic designers that don't even know that they're strategic designers, and are visual designers, strategic designers if they design strategically, which they do. Like every good, visual designer designs strategically. Are they strategic designers? They're designing strategically. What does the term mean? Are we strategy designers? Like what? Like it's very wide, and I think that's very problematic.
Okay, but then if you had to come with your contribution to what strategic design is, can you try to define it in like 1 or 2 sentences and give us an idea of what you believe is strategic design?
Tough one. I mean, it's about it's probably something like applying designerly ways of working and thinking to strategic challenges, but doesn't really have to be strategic challenges either. Only I think, but maybe what's a strategic challenge? What's not? Maybe it's something about applying designerly ways of thinking and working to challenges that tend to lend themselves to ambiguity and complexity. Yeah, that would maybe be it. Because I think that can, and again, that's super wide, right? Yeah. I mean, one of these challenges would be sustainability. Yes, you can apply strategic design too. I mean, in the wide sense of strategic design, which is the issue of it as well, maybe that definition wouldn't be too far off, at least for how I see it.
Maybe also for the fact that it is so wide, maybe that also gives the possibility to evolve a bit more also for the coming years. How do you see your work changing, both in the near future, but also, let's say, for the next 10 years?
I want to maybe reflect to that question on the actual term or the positions that are advertised as strategic designers, which I'm, by the way, not. I'm a business designer. But I think there is 2 paths that from an industry perspective, and I'm talking from the consultancy perspective as well, or agency perspective, this could go into, I think. One is, I think, where the term gets watered down to a degree where strategic design means designing strategically, which every agency will jump on. And I think you can see that happening already, particularly in Copenhagen. There is almost no agency that doesn't claim to do strategic design.
We have the same in Helsinki as well. So many new studios or agencies just put the word strategic somewhere.
Yeah, because it's about, again, proving value, right? It's about showing that you understand business, essentially. So that's one lane, and that's happening. And then I think there could be like a counter movement to that, where you say, actually, maybe strategic design isn't communications design, these kinds of things. Maybe strategic design is really rooted in the word strategy, and it becomes more of a strategy design kind of thing. And I think that's where maybe I see, at least from my perspective, what I would also maybe like to see is that, again, we gain that seat on the board tables, so to speak, where, through maybe then you just sell yourself as a strategist, but then you're also competing with management. It's hard, right? It's really hard. But putting strategy back into strategic design, so to speak, and like really think about, there's so much change that's just around the corner that needs to happen, and it needs business change. But because it's so different, it needs creativity. So I think that's just the value, really. I think also that's why, all consultancies, agencies that were on a smaller scale got bought by management consultancies. Like even Fjord, like we talked about the other day, Fjord getting, who got bought by Accenture and are now part of Accenture Song. It's such a strong brand. It's such a crazy decision to kind of just erase that brand equity, talking about Jaguar again. Like, it's crazy. But anyways, I digress. Yeah, I think those are the two routes. But then and I root for the second route, where it really becomes an integral part of designing strategy and transforming businesses from a very, also like creativity, but also understanding business and being in the nitty gritty, not just, wouldn't it be cool? What if kind of thing. But for that to happen, you have to answer, at least we would have to answer. And that's also a conversation that we're having. How do you compete with management consultancies on that? They have bought the creativity. They can't buy the culture, you could argue. So there is a difference in that still, which is, I think, why a lot of people maybe have less of a desire to work at these places, even though they pay considerably different. I put that well. Yeah, that will be a market battle. And that's already like, it depends on the conversations and the context that the network also that you have, actually the way into it. Again, if a company is looking to fix a problem in their supply chain that they are aware of, probably not a strategic design challenge. That's probably better suited for, specialized resources within that who are, quantitative driven and, dive really deep into that. So it's probably a nature of the problem there as well. And then maybe there's also, if it's more transformation cases where, a company really has to reimagine their ways of running and their ways of doing business. Maybe there could be a combination in the future. Like, what if strategic design, if it is the strategy design track that we talked about, what if that is complementary to the traditional business design ways of thinking? A complementary approach rather than an either or question where you have both present with two different perspectives to work on that challenge. That's, I think, like the inevitable question of how do you travel up the decision-making ladder? But I think to the point of like being able to afford strategic design, these kinds of things, again, I think like if you're external, there's an advantage here, because a lot of the time why you would even engage a consultancy, strategic design consultancy at that as well, is because, well, of course, one, they hopefully know what they're doing, but more so, I think you have an external perspective, right, as you were saying as well, but also you get results way faster than if that would happen internally, even if there was a strategic designer internally, because they are bound by, internal structures and these kinds of things as well. That's the value that you offer as a consultancy of any sort, that you get stuff done way quicker than if it was done in-house. So in that sense, I think, there's a value there as well.
Do you have an advice for people who are interested in entering the field of strategic design?
I think, it's a very basic advice, but if you're interested in it, have conversations with people that are in it. Like, don't be afraid to reach out. Usually, either you're ghosted, then you're ghosted. That's also okay. But most times, people are very happy to have a chat, have a conversation. And then, things just fall from there often, and you learn more things and you get to learn more people and these kinds of things. Another one would be very stereotypical, but stay curious. Like if you have an interest, dive into it and like just really go for it. Because again, like, what do you want to do within strategic design? Do you more want to be on the strategy side, or do you actually want to be a service designer? Because I think even as a service designer, maybe that's one term, right? We know what service design is, even though that's also on the fringes of business design and these kinds of things. But there's titles, service design titles that you can go for and these kinds of things. So ask maybe, what is it within strategic design that attracts you? I don't know why, but I often think about strategic design as just like, if you can't decide, just become a strategic designer. Yeah, so talk to people and like follow your curiosity.
What are top 3 podcasts that you can recommend for our listeners, maybe within the field of strategy?
There's one called The Great Simplification.
Yeah.
With a guy called Nate Hagens. And that talks about everything in terms of like, I don't even know how to explain it. It's like, if you're into like, post-growth, degrowth, these kinds of things, it's great because it really like double clicks on some of the fundamental things of, thinking of the earth as systems, and talks about, the energy equation and how crazy that actually is. And all these kinds of things. So that's a great one. And I do like that one, but it's true, I don't listen to podcasts so much.
But Medium, and are there any?
Yeah, I mean, I still have like my subscription there, and it's like, I think it's like this thing of like, you get recommendations, you feed your algorithm type thing. There's certain like collectives that you can follow. I think there's one on strategic design as well. Speculative design, I quite like. But then there is like books. Books are just, books are so nice. Like
we love books.
We love books, exactly. And I don't know. I don't have a reading list that I can give.
But also, you've been publishing some articles around.
Yeah, exactly. Like I try to sometimes, you're going around a topic, and then like when you try to write it down, you actually are forced to make sense of it a little bit more. So I also actually, I have used Medium in the past for that. And then, some thought leadership content through Designit, back then Kontrapunkt as well.
People can read that.
They can, exactly. Yeah, they can. Yeah. And I must say, like, I love YouTube, like way too much.
Next for you. Anything fun coming up? Any cool projects or?
Good question. Hopefully a pretty cool project coming up. We should get the answer today. So fingers crossed. Which would be a more service design project on like improving service experiences in a spatial context and service offerings and these kinds of things. So that would be nice. And I think the other thing that we really want to kind of like reignite is, again, like design for sustainability at large, and in particular in a well-being economy context. So how can we address this discrepancy between reducing things while growing output? Hopefully reinvigorating, I think, a position that Designit Copenhagen had quite strongly. And then also I think, all this AI thing happened and people like really jumped on that. And I think a lot of attention went there. So that would be nice to get, a bit more focus on that in terms of projects as well. Then I'm spending my winter in South Africa with my partner. Oh, so that's lovely. Coming up.
And where can listeners find you online if they want to follow your career?
Probably LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's linkedin.com. Yeah. And feel free to reach out. I'm always happy for a online or coffee chat.
If you enjoyed today's episode of Unfolding Strategic Design, make sure to follow us on LinkedIn, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Your support helps us bring in more inspiring voices from the world of strategic design.